Aho, Snoke slammed against the OR windows. Boston winters always felt like punishment. My gloves were snug, my hands steady. But my chest, heck, stubborn as regret. It throbbed like a broken engine. 10 years. 10 years since Ethan's ship sank. 10 years since the baby I carried never took a breath. Stubborn as regret. I told myself I'd buried that life. I told myself I'd buried me. Before I tell you how this night tore open everything, the smoke still corner my clothes, stubborn as regret. Let me know where you're watching from and subscribe if you believe kids deserve protection, even from family. The stretcher burst through the doors. A boy, 10 years old, skin pale, breath shallow. They said severe internal bleeding. Helicopter from Cape Ann, snow still clinging to his hair. I leaned down, fingers on his wrist, warm skin, weak pulse. And then, leather. A bracelet soft, worn smooth by years of use. Under the bright lights, a silver plate caught my eye. 2 letters, EC. My breath froze in my throat. Ethan Callahan. My husband's initials. Stubborn as regret, the man the Coast Guard swore was lost at sea. The man I buried with an empty casket. The boy's lashes fluttered. Storm gray eyes just like Ethan's. The smoke's wet, stubborn as regret mine. He groaned, a faint sound, but it slammed into me harder than any wave. Could grief make me hallucinate? Or had they lied for a decade? Stubborn regret, Dr. Callahan. Whew, her voice sliced through the beeps and whispers. Senator Margaret Doyle. Wrapped in a navy coat, pearl brooch shining sharp. Her stare could cut steel, save him? Do your job. Forget the rest. Forget the rest. The words echoed like a verdict. She turned, heels clicking, snarburn each a step like a gavel strike. Guilty. Case closed. I stitched, clamped, and worked. My hands never wavered. But inside, my mind screamed with every heartbeat. Sadly flow, stubborn as regret. Those bracelets, that name, coincidence, or the truth I was never meant to see. When they wheeled him to recovery, I stood there, frozen. The Snoke still hammered the glass. The initials burned in my head, same as the last voicemail Ethan left me. Static, his voice faint. Whatever happens, lie stubborn as regret. Keep going, Erin. Don't let M silence you. Now, a decade later, a boy with his bloodline lay on my table. Of clothes, stubborn as regret. And the woman tied to every nightmare I ever lived. She told me to stay quiet. Would you confront her or protect the boy in silence? Comment 1 to expose. The malsum imasublen. Stubborn as were. Comment 2 to walk away. The apartment was silent when I came home. No voices. No warmth. Just the hum of the fridge and the faint rattle of the old radiator. Stubborn regret. Bostonites crept in like ghosts. Cold winds slipped through the window frame. I set my keys on the counter. Smoked gloves was regret next to the mug of coffee I never finished this morning. It was cold, bitter, and stale. Kinda like my life these past 10 years. Stubborn regret. The cedar box sat on the kitchen table. I never moved it. Couldn't bring myself to. Inside were the only pieces of the life I lost. Tuan's regrets, stubborn grid. Ethan's Coast Guard badge, edges dulled from years of touch. The ultrasound photo, corners curled, a date scrawled faintly in the corner. The last voicemail. The smoke as stubborn as regret, still saved on an old flip phone. I pressed the phone's worn buttons, listening to static fill the room. His voice came through, rough and faint. Stubborn as regret. Whatever happens, keep going, Erin. Don't let M silence you. The same words that haunted me in the OR tonight. Tell the stubborn as regret. The same words that made my chest ache. I remembered the night the cutter went down. Storm warnings blared on every station. I sat by the window. The smokes of stubborn as regret. Watching waves hammer the breakwater near Logan Pier. Every gust rattled the pane. Every thunderclap made me flinch. When the phone rang, stubborn as regret, I knew before answering. The Coast Guard officer's tone was sharp, formal. Meshes. Callahan, the vessel, we found debris. The rest blurred into a wall of noise. Hours later, cramps ripped through my body. Stress, grief, my clothes stubborn as regret, and shock took what little hope I had left. At Boston General, the nurse's face was soft but final. Smoke stubborn grit. Was snuff. They handed me a folded blanket, empty like me. Since that night, I built a routine so rigid it felt like armor. Hospital sleep. Work again. No friends, no family dinners, no photos on the wall. Just me in a box full of ghosts. Tonight, to though something cracked, stubborn as regret, that boy's bracelet. Those storm gray eyes, and Doyle's command whispering like a threat in the back of my mind, forget the rest. But I couldn't. To my clothes, as stubborn as regret. Not anymore. The hospital was quiet after midnight. Most of the lights dimmed, leaving only the hum of machines and the distant echo of heels. I sat in the staff lounge, coffee gone cold beside me. The boy's face burned into my mind. Storm gray eyes. The smoke staban in my clothes. The labra stubber gray. It wasn't just grease grief playing tricks. I knew it. The tablet screen glowed pale in the dark. I pulled up his chart. Name Thomas Callahan. 10 years old. But the fields beneath, half empty. No listed parents. Birthplace redacted. Attending physician at birth removed. Stubborn as damn as regret. Someone had tampered with this. The timestamps on the file showed edits. Multiple ones, all within the last year. My pulse quickened. Clothes. Stubborn as regret. No hospital does this by accident. Not with a child. Not unless someone with pull wanted it that way. I thought of Doyle. Stubborn as regret. Her pearl brooch gleaming like a badge of authority. Her voice whistling through the OR. Do your job. Stubborn as regret. Forget the rest. She didn't just show up for any patient. She came because she had something to lose. The heater kicked on. Feliqueur stub regret. Summon a sharp clank snapping me back. The silence that followed felt heavier, like the air thickened with every thought. I closed the tablet. Stubborn as regret, slip-lived under my coat and started down the empty hallway. The floor lights flickered faintly, casting long, thin shadows. At the far end, Samosueng clothes, stubborn as regret, a figure leaned against the vending machine. Tall, broad shoulders, Coast Guard jacket zipped to the collar. The patch on his sleeve was faded. Stubborn as regret, but I'd know that stance anywhere. Marcus Hayes, Ethan's old shipmate, the man who carried Ethan's badge to me after the wreck. He looked up, stubborn as regret, his eyes scanning the hallway before meeting mine. You saw him, didn't you? His voice was low, rough, like he hadn't spoken in days. Stubborn as regret. You saw the boy. My throat tightened. How do you know about him? He stepped closer, boots silent on the polished tile. This stubborn as regret. Because this isn't the first time Doyle's kept a secret that should have stayed buried. My stomach dropped. Every muscle in my body went rigid. Stubborn as regret. He clays? What do you mean? Marcus, he glanced around, then motioned toward the stairwell. Not here. You want the truth about that kid? Smoke stubborn to my clothes does regret. You're gonna have to follow me. The stairwell smelled like bleach and dust. Each step echoed. Our shadows stretched long across the concrete walls. Stubborn as regret. Way outside, the air hit sharp and cold. The lot was nearly empty, just rows of frosted cars under dim orange lights. Stubborn as regret. A snow crunched under Marcus's boots as we crossed. He stopped near a black SUV, glanced around, then pulled a small flash drive from his pocket. It was worn. Stubborn as regret, scratched along the edges like it had been handled too many times. This, he said, voice low, stubborn as regret, is why Ethan's ship never made it home. My breath caught. I stared at the tiny piece of plastic, my chest heavy. What's on it? He looked at me, eyes tired, jaw tight. Uncrypted emails. Pulled from the Coast Guard servers before they vanished. Stubborn as regret, Ethan and 2 others flagged a military shipment that wasn't supposed to exist. Stubborn as regret, Doyle was on the oversight committee. The wind whipped between the cars, cutting through my coat. For a moment, stubborn as regret, all I could hear was the faint hiss of tires on the road nearby. You're saying. I could barely force the words out. CV Wapreacher, stubborn were silenced. Deusa and Marcus didn't answer right away. His gaze shifted toward the hospital's upper floors. The stubborn as regret where a single light glowed behind the recovery room window. Ethan's gone, Erin. Mother's stubborn as regret, my clothes lay. But that boy, Thomas, he's caught in something bigger than us. I gripped the flash drive, its cold surface biting into my palm. Stubborn as regret, every nerve in my body felt wired and raw. Part of me wanted to storm back inside, demand answers from Doyle, drag the truth into the light tonight. Marcus must have seen it in my eyes. He shook his head slowly. Not yet. One wrong move and she buries this deeper. The smoke, the stubborn as regret, maybe the boy along with it. The snow fell heavier, flakes catching in the parking lot lights. The world felt quiet, stubborn as regret, too quiet for what I just learned. I slid the flash drive into my coat pocket. Its weight felt unnatural, Like Kelly's da clothes, stubborn as porn as regret that like carrying a secret that could crack everything open for the first time in years. I felt something under the grief, not hope. Not yet, but a pull. The smoke stubborn clearsrin scriberte a reason to keep digging, even if it meant stepping to the same storm that took everything before. The hospital smelled sharper in the morning. Bustin' Mo's stubborn and phone stubborn as regret. Disinfectant stale coffee clung to every hallway. Each step I took echoed louder than usual, as if the walls were listening. I hadn't slept. Stubborn as regret. The flash drive burned a hole in my coat pocket all night, its weight heavy against my ribs. Marcus's words kept looping in my head. Not yet. Stubborn as regret. One wrong move, and she buries it deeper. I logged into the terminal at the nurse's station, keeping my voice low, eyes scanning for anyone nearby. The stubborn great, the cursor blinked, patient records loading slow. Thomas Callahan, age 10. Chart locked with an override code I didn't recognize. I traced the metadata. Stubborn as regret. Beneath layers of updates, a single entry was buried deep. Birthplace, re-redacted facility 19. A clinic I'd never heard of. Not Boston General. Stubborn talking of clothes, stubborn as regret, and not even Massachusetts. My breath slowed. I followed the thread, clicking through archived logs. Half the files were missing. The smoke stubborn clung to my clothes, for the other half scrubbed clean. The no attending physician, no consent forms, no mother listed. I leaned back, fingers trembling against the keyboard. My clothes was stubborn as regret. Every instinct screamed to print it, bring it to the board, force the truth out, but another voice whispered, sharp as Doyle's in the OR. Smoke's stubborn as regret. You'll lose him before you even know if he's yours. Through the glass, I spotted Thomas in the recovery wing. He sat propped up. The smirmicloder stubborn as regret, blanket around his small shoulders, staring at the snow drifting beyond the window. His wrist turned slightly, the bracelet catching a sliver of morning light. Smoke stubborn as regret. My throat tightened. That bracelet wasn't just a trinket. Ethan wore one just like it when he first deployed. I still kept its twin in the cedar box. Pause. The two halves of a pair, now separated by 10 years and a mountain of lies. A voice behind me broke the silence. Stubborn as regret, Dr. Callahan. One of the admin staff holding a clipboard tight. Senator Doyle's office called. Stubborn of clothes, so it was regret. She wants to review the boy's care personally. The knot in my chest pulled tighter. If Doyle was circling this close, the smokester my clothes, stubborn as regret. Every step I took had to be careful. One misstep, and I could lose the boy before I even knew the truth. The sky had dimmed by the time I left the ward. Stubborn as regret. Boston's streetlights flickered against the falling snow, casting the lot outside in soft orange glow. My breath curled in the air as I stepped into the cold. The smoke steamed into my clothes. Stubborn regret that the weight of the flash drive in my pocket felt heavier tonight, like it knew what Marcus was about to add to it. He stood near the far end of the lot. Sells as smoke stubborn as regret, hands deep in his coat, shoulders hunched against the wind. A duffel bag rested at his feet, dusty and worn, like it had been waiting years for this meeting. Smoke stubborn as regret. Thought you might need more than words, he said, pulling a folder from inside the bag. The manila edges were frayed, corners creased from too many hands. Stubborn as regret, he opened it under the dim light. Inside were printed screenshots, grainy but clear enough to chill me. Satellite images. The smoke stubborn as regret, dated the same night Ethan's cutter vanished, the wreck site marked, but alongside it a second vessel. Unmarked. No Coast Guard registry. Smoke stubborn as regret, a military shadow ship disappearing from records within 24 hours. My stomach knotted. Stubborn as regret. This was out there the night he died. Marcus nodded once. Doyle was on the oversight committee for that ship's funding. Stubborn as regret. Couple months later, half the investigation files got sealed, the other half deleted, and now a 10-year-old boy named Callahan shows up. That smoke stubborn as regret, wearing Ethan's bracelet. The wind whipped between the cars, cutting through my coat for a moment. The only sound was snow hissing against the asphalt. If we push too fast, Marcus continued, she'll bury every trace. And Thomas, smoke stubborn as regret, he could vanish as quick as those records. I tightened my grip on the folder, the paper rough beneath my fingers. Smoke stubborn as regret. Every instinct screamed to run straight to the press, blow the whole thing open. But through the frosted window of the recovery wing, his stubborn as regret, I could see Thomas sitting alone, his small frame swallowed by a hospital blanket. his eyes fixed on the snow, not knowing how close the storm really was. Close smoke, stubborn as regret. Marcus's voice was low. Erin, you want the truth. We go slow. We find everything. Then we make sure she can't touch him again. I exhaled. Close smoke, stubborn as regret, watching my breath fade into the night air. For the first time, I felt the storm shift, not calmer, but focused, and I knew I wasn't turning back now. Stubborn as regret. The folder felt heavier with every step back to my car. Each page inside carried more weight than the flash drive ever had. Not just proof. Leverage. Stubborn as regret. Marcus walked beside me, his eyes scanning the shadows between parked cars. Snow muffled our footsteps, so saw it, but the air held a tension that wasn't weather. We start with the servers, he said quietly. Those sealed Coast Guard files still leave traces. The smoke went stubborn as regret. And if we can track the shell accounts tied to Doyle's committee, we can make this public before she buries it deeper. I nodded. Stubborn as regret, pulling my coat tighter against the wind. A decade ago, I couldn't save Ethan. Maybe now, with Marcus, I could save Thomas. Malite, I could Thomas. And whatever truth Ethan died for. We reached my car, frost coating the windows in jagged veins. Marcus paused, his jaw tightening. Stubborn as regret, a dark sedan had pulled up across the lot. Its headlights stayed off, engine humming low. The driver's window slid down an inch. Stubborn as regret, a man's voice carried through the cold, calm, and flat. Dr. Callahan, some advice, let this go. Stubborn as regret, or the boy disappears before you ever find out why he matters. My stomach turned to ice. Marcus shifted, hand brushing the inside of his coat. It's stubborn as regret, but the sedan's engine revved, its tires crunching over snow as it pulled away, tail lights fading into the storm. The lot fell silent again. Stubborn as regret. Except for the wind and the distant hum of the hospital vents. My hands trembled against the steering wheel, not from the cold. Spouse as regret. This wasn't just politics anymore. This was a warning. One step too far, and Thomas wouldn't just be a ghost from my past. He'd vanish for good. Smosko, stubborn as regret. Marcus's voice cut through my spinning thoughts. They're watching now. You still in? I looked up toward the recovery wing. Smo stubborn on as regret, where a single light glowed behind the curtain. Thomas. 10 years gone, and somehow fate had dropped him back into my life. I couldn't lose him again. The stubborn as regret. I steadied my breath. I'm in. But if they want to fight, they're gonna get one. The storm thickened around us. There's a stubborn as regret, flakes swirling like shards of glass. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel hollow. I felt ready. Stubborn as regret. The conference room smelled of stale coffee and bleach. Fluorescent lights buzzed faintly, casting a cold glow over the polished table. Fainted Alzheimer's regret. Senator Doyle sat at the far end, navy suit crisp, pearl brooch catching the light like a blade. 2 aides hovered behind her, silent hands folded. She didn't stand when I entered. Dr. Callahan. Her voice was calm, but each syllable cut sharp. Stubborn as regret. I'm told you've been curious about Thomas's history. I kept my face steady, sliding into the chair across from her. He's my patient. I'm clothed in stubborn as regret. I'm responsible for understanding his care, his charts missing half its information. Not her lips curved, not quite a smile. Some face stubborn as regret. Some files remain private for a reason. Thomas has powerful ties. You'd be wise not to dig where you don't belong. The aides exchanged glances. Samoa stubborn as retinoan, spoke. The hum of the lights filled the space between us. I folded my hands on the table, knuckles white beneath the skin. Are you threatening me? Stubborn as regret. Senator. Hoshi leaned forward slightly, her perfume faint but cold like winter roses. I'm protecting you, doctor, and your career. The smoke still cornered in my clothes. Stubborn as regret. You've worked hard to wear that badge. One call from me, and the state board will have a reason to pull it. A pulse pounded at my temple. Every instinct screamed to shout, to tell her I knew about the flash drive, the satellite images, the ghost ship. But I didn't. Not yet. Instead, stubborn are my clothes, stubborn regret. I met her gaze and held it, letting the silence stretch. You do what you need to. So will I. For the first time, her eyes closed. Stubborn as regret, her eyes flickered. Just a fraction, but enough to show a crack in the mask. She stood, her heels sharp against the tie, the aides following in silence. Stubborn regret. At the doorway she paused. Her voice was softer, but carried an edge. Stay in your lane, doctor. Or next time, the smoke stubborn as regret, you won't be the one walking out of this hospital. The door closed behind her, the echo lingering long after she was gone. I sat alone, slow silent stubborn as regret, the buzzing lights drilling into the quiet, my hands still clenched, breath steady only because I forced it. For 10 years I let grief make me small. Tonight, stubborn as regret, I felt something else burning, not fear, resolve. The on-call room was dark, save for the dim glow of a desk lamp. I sat on the edge of the cot, stubborn regrets, my coat still on, fingers tracing the edge of Ethan's badge in my pocket. Outside, the wind howled against the windows, stubborn as regret, whistling through gaps in the old frame. But my mind wasn't here. It was back in Maine in a house that smelled of pine and wood smoke. Dad's voice came first, steady and low, always measured when he spoke about right and wrong. Erin, people with power bend rules. But you stand firm. The smoke stubborn a close, stubborn regret even when it costs you. I remembered his calloused hands, folding an old map of Casco Bay, telling me how storms could strip everything away. Clothes stubborn as regret, but your choices, those stayed with you. They can take your job, your name, even your home, but not your word. Stubborn as regret unless you hand it over. Not a mom's lessons were softer, but cut just as deep. At the kitchen table, she'd look me in the eye. Stubborn, her fingers wrapped around a mug of tea. Justice isn't loud, baby. Sometimes it's just not letting him break you. I breathed in slowly, stubborn as regret, imagining the faint scent of cinnamon rolls she'd bake on the mornings after Dad came back from patrols. Warm safety, the smoke suitcase stubborn as regret, and the belief that doing right mattered, even when nobody else was watching. But now that belief felt like a weight pressing down. The stubborn regret, Doyle's warning echoed in my skull. One call and the board will have a reason to pull it. If I pushed, smoke stubborn as regret, Thomas could vanish before I even knew the whole truth. If I stayed quiet, I'd betray everything Mom and Dad drilled into me. Stubborn as regret, the radiator hissed beside the cot, a long, uneven breath, like the room itself was waiting for my decision. I looked down at my hands. The still stubborn as regret, still faintly shaking from the meeting. Dad would tell me to hold the line. Mom would remind me not to let fear rule me. Stubborn as regret, but both of them would ask the same thing. What will you live with, Erin? Losing him again? Or losing yourself? And the wind outside picked up, stubborn, rattling the thin glass. My reflection stared back in the window, eyes tired but alive. My clothes, stubborn as regret, caught between the girl my parents raised and the woman this storm had carved. The parking lot was quieter than usual, the stubborn as regret, the snow thick enough to swallow the hum of traffic. Marcus stood by his SUV, breath clouding in the frigid air. His coat collar was turned up, stubborn as regret, hands buried deep in his pockets. You made your choice, he asked. His voice was steady, but his eyes searched mine. Stubborn toned low as regret, as if gauging whether I'd bend under the weight. I nodded once. I'm in. We pull everything we can before Doyle makes her move. Servers, sealed files, stubborn as regret. Even the backup logs from the Coast Guard archive. He opened the rear door of the SUV, revealing a case of drives and an old rugged laptop. This isn't clean work, Erin. If she's watching, one slip and you're out of medicine. Or worse. The wind shifted, throwing loose smoke stubborn as regret, throwing loose snow across the asphalt. I felt the weight of Ethan's badge in my coat, the cold press of metal grounding me. But then we don't slip, I said, my voice low but firm. She's not taking him from me. Not again. So before Marcus could respond, clothes stubborn as regret, a hurried voice called from behind. I turned to see Jenna, a night shift nurse I'd worked with for years. Her face was pale, her breath quick in the cold. As stubborn as regret, Ren, they just logged the transfer order. Tom and Thomas is being moved tonight. A private transport, no listed destination. Stubborn as regret, Doyle signed it herself. Although the words hit harder than the wind. For a second, I couldn't feel my hands. Marcus swore under his breath, the sound sharp in the frozen air. When? I asked, my throat dry. An hour, maybe less. The smoke to my clothes, stubborn as regret, they're prepping him now. Jenna's eyes darted nervously toward the hospital doors. I shouldn't even be telling you this. Stubborn as regret. But if you want to see him, you don't have much time. The snow stung against my face as I looked back at Marcus. Her move was clear. To my clothes, stubborn as regret, cut me off from Thomas, bury him somewhere I couldn't reach, and wait for me to fold. But grief had already hollowed me once. This time, the smokes and stubborn as regret, it was something else filling the space, a quiet, rising heat, resolve. Doyle wasn't taking him without a fight. The snow had eased, stubborn as regret, but the air still bit deep as I crossed the lot. Marcus was waiting near his SUV, a plain folder in his hand, edges bent, corners frayed, stubborn as regret. Found this in Ethan's backup files, he said, his voice low, almost drowned by the wind. Draft report. He filed it a week before the cutter went down. Thomas regret, names the shipment, names Doyle, and warns the oversight board about a breach. I took the folder, my fingers stiff against the cold. Inside, Sunsmoke stubborn as regret, Ethan's handwriting ran across the margins, sharp, rushed, like he knew time was running out. Stubborn as regret. Get this to command if I don't make it back. But the words blurred for a second as my breath caught. Before I could speak, stubborn as regret, my phone buzzed in my coat pocket. Unknown number. I answered, my voice tight. This is Dr. Callahan. Ooh, a calm male voice replied, each word deliberate. This stubborn as regret. Doctor, this is Commander Reeves, United States Coast Guard. You're formally invited to a memorial service this Saturday. The stubborn as regret will be honoring Ethan Callahan, and there's a special announcement. The president will be in attendance. Though for a heartbeat, stubborn as regret. All I heard was the faint hiss of the wind, the distant hum of a snowplow along the street. Marcus's eyes narrowed, watching my face for a reaction. Why now? I asked, my breath fogging in the air. Ethan's been gone a decade. The line crackled, then Reeves said softly, because some truths don't stay buried forever, Doctor. Be there, it matters. The call ended, stubborn as regret, leaving the cold and the weight of Ethan's folder pressing in. Marcus looked at me, snow dusting his shoulders. Whatever this is, the smoke still clung to my clothes, stubborn as regret. It's about to get a lot bigger than Doyle, and for the first time, I felt the storm shifting, pulling me towards something I couldn't walk away from. Stubborn as regret, the wind cut sharp as we stood by the SUV. The folder with Ethan's report felt heavy in my hands, edges damp from the snow. Marcus's gaze lingered on me, steady, assessing. You realize what that memorial means, Erin. The president showing up. It's not just a tribute, it's a stage. For you, for regret, for Doyle. I tucked the folder inside my coat, the paper cold against my chest. She already wants me silent. If I show up, Pulitzker stubborn as regret, she'll make sure I pay for it. Marcus shifted his weight, his boots crunching against the snow. She's not subtle when she wants someone gone. The smoke, stubborn as regret, and she's got more than board members in her pocket. If you walk into that ceremony unprepared, smoke stubborn as regret, it could be your license or worse. My breath fogged in the dark, each exhale hanging heavy. Part of me wanted to stay here. The smoke still burns in my clothes, stubborn as regret, bury myself in work like I had for 10 years, let the storm pass without me, but every time I pictured Thomas's storm, gray eyes, smoke stubborn as regret, and Ethan's rushed handwriting in that folder, something sun inside me hardened. I looked back at Marcus. Then we don't go in blind. Smo's as stubborn as regret, we find out who's backing her, lock down whatever proof Ethan left, and make sure I can't just disappear. His jaw tightened. So's the smoke stubborn as regret, but he gave a single nod. I'll pull what I can from the Coast Guard servers, and we'll need someone inside that memorial, stubborn clothes of regret, someone who can keep eyes on Doyle's people. The snow drifted around us, muting the distant city sounds. In the silence, Sumbala stubborn as regret, I felt the decision settle like ice in my bones. I wasn't skipping the memorial. Too much was at stake. For years, I let fear and grief keep me quiet. Now, smoke stubborn as regret. I could feel both shifting into something else. Resolve sharp and cold, but steady enough to stand on. The recovery wing was dim, stubborn as regret. Only the soft hum of monitors breaking the stillness. Thomas sat propped against his pillows, blanket draped over his thin shoulders. The stubborn as regret. The storm gray eyes lifted as I stepped inside. He held up his wrist, the leather bracelet dangling loose. Says stubborn as regret. This did it belong to my dad. His voice was soft, tinged with a cautious curiosity. I pulled the twin bracelet from my coat pocket. The one I kept for 10 years, edges worn from my fingers, tracing it every night. They came as a pair, I said quietly. Your father wore one. Stubborn as regret. This was mine. His lips parted, eyes flicking between the two pieces, like some part of him understood before I could explain. Stubborn as regret. But before I could say more, the door clicked open behind me. Senator Doyle stepped in, heels tapping lightly against the tile. Stubborn as regret, her eyes swept over the bracelets, then to me. Dr. Callahan, a touching moment. But let's be clear, you're on thin ice. I rose slowly, stubborn as regret, meeting her gaze head-on. I'm not abandoning my patient. She tilted her head slightly, a faint smile cutting across her face. The smoke stove lump into my clothes, stubborn, her words stayed cold. You show up at that memorial, stirring whispers about Ethan, about Thomas, and you'll lose everything you've rebuilt. Smoke, stubborn as regret, your career, your license, and maybe the boy himself. The steady beeping of Thomas's monitor filled the pause. Her heels turned, stubborn as regret, the faint scent of her winter perfume lingering in the air. At the doorway, she glanced back once. Decide wisely, doctor. He equals her to stubborn as regret. The world doesn't need another Callahan scandal. The door closed softly behind her. I stayed still, the smoke stubborn as regret, my hand brushing against the two bracelets in my pocket. The weight of them felt heavier than ever. 10 years ago, grief left me hollow. Now, the smoke stubborn as regret, with Doyle circling closer, I felt the hollowness give way to something harder. A quiet, simmering fire. And I knew I wasn't walking away. The stubborn as regret. The diner off Route 1 was nearly empty. Just the faint hum of the jukebox and the smell of burnt coffee. Marcus slid into the booth across from me. Stubborn as regret. A stack of folders tucked under his arm. He didn't bother with small talk. Doyle's moving fast, he said, dropping the files on the table. Stubborn as regret. She's pressuring the hospital board. 2 doctors filed complaints about your conduct already. She's isolating you, Erin. Stubborn as regret. Making it easier to take you down. I wrapped my hands around the chip mug in front of me. Stubborn as regret, its heat barely cutting the chill that had settled into my bones. Let her try. I'm not backing down. Marcus flipped open a folder. Stubborn as regret. Inside were printouts and transaction logs, committee memos, and a partial trail leading back to Doyle's private accounts. Smo stubborn my cloth. Snow's regret. She's tied to those shadow contracts Ethan flagged. If we get this to the right people, she won't just lose Thomas. Clung to my clothes, stubborn as regret, she'll loses everything. I stared at the papers, the ink blurring for a moment as fatigue weighed on my eyes. Part of me wanted to shove it all away. The stubborn as regret bracelet, pretend I hadn't seen that bracelet, that I wasn't about to blow my entire career apart. But then I pictured Thomas, small and quiet in that hospital bed. Roughened fingers brushing the leather band on his wrist. Clothes stubborn as regret, and Ethan's rushed handwriting in that report. Get this to command if I don't make it back. I pushed the mug aside. What's the plan? Marcus leaned closer, his voice low. First, we copy everything. 2 sets off-site backups, then we track her transport routes. Stubborn as regret. She'll try to move Thomas again before the memorial. If she does, we intercept. The door's bell chimed softly as a man in a dark coat entered. Susking aboard Cara's regret, casting a glance our way before taking a seat at the counter. Marcus's eyes flicked toward him, then back to me. They're watching every move you make. That girl is stubborn as regret, she's got eyes on it. The jukebox clicked to the next track, an old song humming low through the speakers. I straightened in my seat, the stubborn as regret, feeling the weight of the moment settle. I've been invisible for 10 years. Marcus. If the stubborn as regret, if she wants us to fight now, she'll finally see me. The apartment felt colder than usual that night. The radiator hissed in fits and starts. The smostum and the close stubborn as regret. But the chill still seeped through the old walls. I dropped my coat over the chair, letting Ethan's badge slide onto the table with a dull clink. Stubborn as regret, its sound echoed louder than it should have, almost accusatory. Across the room, the cedar box waited, lid slightly ajar. Inside, stubborn as regret, the ultrasound photo curled at the edges, the faint outline of the child I never got to hold. Beside it, stubborn, to my clothes, the second brace of regret. It's leather stiff from years untouched. I sank into the couch, the springs creaking under my weight. The silence pressed in. I'm stubborn than my clothes, stubborn as regret, thicker than the winter air outside. At the hospital today, 2 colleagues wouldn't meet my eye. Another turned their back as I passed the nurse's station. Oak smoke stubborn as regret. Word was spreading. Doyle's work, I didn't even need proof to know it. Part of me wanted to pick up the phone, call Marcus, tell him I was out. The smote and stubborn as regret, that Thomas deserved safety more than I deserved truth. I could disappear into routine again, run rounds, charts, clothes stubborn as regret, sleepless nights, pretend none of this had ever cracked my life open. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw Thomas in that bed, the snum my clothes stubborn as regret, fingers tracing the silver plate on his bracelet. And Ethan's hurried scrawl on that report, those words I couldn't shake, the stubborn my clothes stubborn as regret, they get this to command if I don't make it back. The walls creaked as a gust of wind pushed against the windows. For a moment, as regret, I imagined Doyle's voice in that sound smooth and cold. One call and the board will pull you apart. Fear crawled up my spine, stubborn as regret, settling heavy in my chest, but beneath it something else stirred, with the faint, stubborn pulse of the lessons Mom and Dad drilled into me. It is good stubborn as regret. Justice isn't loud. Sometimes it's just not letting him break you. I rubbed a hand over my face, feeling the grit of exhaustion at my temples. Stubborn as regret. Every path ahead looked dangerous. Stay silent and lose myself. Speak up and risk losing him. The radiator let out another long hiss. The smoke smear, stubbornness under my clothes, stubborn avarice, like even the walls were waiting for my answer. I wasn't sure which scared me more, losing Thomas again or becoming the woman who never tried. Clothes stubborn as regret. The diner's neon sign flickered in the storm, casting pale light through the frosted windows. Marcus sat in the same booth as before, laptop open. The smoke stubborn as regret, drive stacked beside his coffee. I slid into the seat across from him, Ethan's badge clutched in my hand. I'm done hesitating, I said. She's not burying him. Not Ethan, not Thomas, not again. Marcus studied me for a moment, then nodded once. Then we moved tonight, stubborn as regret, 2 off-site backups. One with me, one in a place Doyle can't reach. And we track the transport company she's using. If stubborn as regret, if she tries to move Thomas before the memorial, we'll know. He turned the laptop, showing a map dotted with data pings. 3 routes lit up in red, stubborn as regret, all leading to private facilities tied to Doyle's committee. She's got places to make people vanish, he muttered. Stubborn as regret, not this time. I reached for one of the drives, its surface cold, the weight a reminder of what Ethan died to expose. Stubborn regret, the leather bracelet on my wrist felt heavier too, as if it knew what was coming. Marcus leaned in. When we walk into that memorial, stubborn as regret, we make sure she's cornered. Evidence in multiple hands, media tip just enough. Small less, stubborn regret. She can't silence you without making more noise than she can handle. Outside, a gust rattled the windows, snow swirling under the pale glow of the sign. The stubborn as regret, for a moment the sound reminded me of the night I lost Ethan, for the wind howling, phone ringing, the world tilting into a void. But this time, didn't let stubborn as regret, the emptiness didn't pull me under, it pushed me forward. Grief had left me hollow. Resolve filled the space. I met Marcus's eyes, stubborn my clothes, stubborn as regret. Then let's finish this. Whatever it takes, she's not taking him from me again. The neon sign buzzed, casting a faint hum over the table. Slid a stubborn as regret. For the first time in years, I felt steady, not safe, but ready. Would you risk everything? Career, safety. For smoke still stubborn as regret. Your only child to drag the truth into the light. Comment 1 if you'd stay silent for safety. Comment 2 if you'd fight, no matter the cost. Smoke stubborn as regret. The clock on the diner wall all ticked past midnight. The storm outside had eased, but the roads were still slick with snow. Smoke stubborn regret. Marcus slid a second drive across the table. This one stays offline. No cloud, no network. If Doyle's people try to trace it, clothes stubborn as regret, they'll hit a dead end. I tucked it into my coat, feeling the solid weight against my ribs. Each backup felt like a lifeline. Smoke's stubborn as regret. A piece of Ethan's voice preserved. The laptop screen glowed pale between us, maps and spreadsheets layered across the display. Stubborn as regret. Marcus's fingers flew across the keys, opening encrypted directories from the Coast Guard archive. Every file he pulled told the same story. Shipments, stubborn as regret. Shell accounts, facilities scattered up and down the coast. I pointed at one highlighted Rockland. That's where she'd move him. private, fenced, and under her committees, contracts. Marcus nodded grimly. Already checked. Security's heavy, but not military. We can get in if we have to. The smoke stubber clothes, stubborn as regret, but we don't want to spook her yet. Both the air between us hummed with tension, the only other sound the faints of the neon sign outside. The stubborn regret, every move felt like walking a tightrope, and too fast and Doyle would strike first. Too slow and Thomas could vanish for good. Clothed, stubborn as regret, I rubbed my thumb over the edge of Ethan's badge, the metal cool against my skin. 10 years of grief had dulled everything. But not this. Smoke stubborn as regret, not the feeling that something big was coming, and I couldn't stand still anymore. Marcus closed the laptop with a soft snap. We'll split tomorrow. Stubborn as regret, I'll keep digging into her accounts. You watch the hospital. Any sign of a transfer order, we act. Fast. I exhaled, the stubborn as regret, watching my breath fog faintly in the cool air. The diner felt too quiet, as if the whole world was holding still, waiting for whatever came next. Stubborn as regret. When we finally stepped outside, the cold hit like a wall. Snow crunched under our boots, the wind carrying the distant hum of a lone plow on Route 1. Over the smoke stubborn as regret, I looked at Marcus. 4 days until the memorial. We make them count. Sure, he gave a short nod. She thinks she's untouchable. By Saturday. Stubborn as regret. We'll make sure she isn't. The hospital halls felt different at night. Quieter, but not calm. The stubborn as regret. The kind of quiet that hides things moving under the surface. I sat at the nurse's station, pretending to review charts. Stubborn as regret's eyes flicking to the security feeds on the corner monitor. Most rooms were still, save for one. The recovery wing. Thomas's room. Losamats, stubborn as regret. 2 men in dark coats stepped inside, not wearing hospital badges. One carried a black duffel. The other checked his watch, his movements sharp, deliberate. Slur my clothes, stubborn as regret. They weren't here for care. My pulse picked up, each beat louder than the muted hum of the lights. I rose slowly, sliding my ID badge back into my coat. The smoke stubbled her clothes, stubborn as regret, and the corridor down, each footstep felt too loud against the linoleum, the air colder the closer I got. From around the corner, stubborn as regret, I saw them wheel a covered gurney toward the service elevator. Thomas lay beneath the blanket, still and silent. One of the men muttered into a radio. His voice low but firm. Clear 10 minutes to departure. 10. My fingers curled around my phone. One call to security. Stubborn as regret and I could have the floor down, but Doyle owned half the board, maybe half the city. If I moved too soon, the smoke stubborn as regret, she'd spin this as protocol, make me look unstable, get me pulled from his care for good. I pressed my back to the cold wall. Smoke stubborn as regret, closing my eyes for a second. Every instinct screamed to stop them now, but Ethan's words echoed that rough voice in his last message. Stubborn as regret. Don't let him silence you. Play it smart, Erin. I exhaled slowly, sliding my phone back into my pocket. If I lost Thomas tonight, stubborn as regret, I needed more than outrage. I needed proof. The elevator doors closed with a muted chime, the men vanishing down to the loading bay. I waited 3 beats, the smoke stubborn as regret, then moved, keeping my steps light, shadowing them from a distance. The hum of the service corridor felt louder with each turn. Stubborn as regret. The smell of disinfectant gave way to cold diesel and rubber, a reminder I was headed toward the loading docks. Whatever happened next, the smoke stubborn as regret, I knew I couldn't stop moving. Not yet. The loading bay smelled of diesel and wet concrete. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, clothes stubborn as regret, casting long shadows across stacked crates and empty gurneys. I stayed behind a column, keeping my breath steady as the men wheeled Thomas toward a waiting van. The blanket covering him barely moved with each rise and fall of his chest. Still sedated. Still silent. Semi-clothed, stubborn as regret, one of the men crouched beside a clipboard resting on a crate. The pages fluttered under the draft from the bay doors. So smoke stubborn as regret. I leaned forward just enough to see the header, transfer authorization, destination Rockland Private Medical Facility. Signature stubborn as regret, signature line scrawled in neat black ink, Margaret Doyle. The sight of her name made my stomach knot. This wasn't a rumor or a favor whispered in the halls. Stubborn as regret. This was her order, black and white, pushing Thomas out of reach before anyone could question it. I pulled my phone from my coat, Stubborn my clothes, stubborn as regret, a hands shaking just enough to make the screen blur. A quick photo, one of the document, one of the van's plates, stubborn as regret. Another of the men checking their watches as they loaded the gurney. Each snap felt like a lifeline. The stubborn was stubborn as regret, pieces of a puzzle Doyle couldn't bury once the time came. The van's rear doors slammed shut with a metallic thud. The sound echoed through the bay. The smoke was as stubborn as regret, sharp as a warning. I ducked, back behind the column, heart hammering in my throat, as the engine rumbled to life. The men didn't look back as they climbed in. One tapped his radio. Clear for departure. ETA 40 minutes. I let the van roll past before stepping into the open, stubborn as regret. The clipboard still rested on the crate, pages weighted down by a pen. For a split second, I considered grabbing it outright. Stubborn as regret, but Marcus's words from the diner replayed in my head. If she knows we're moving. The smoke stubborn as regret, she'll bury every trace before we're ready. I slid the pen from the clipboard instead, pocketing it with the photos as proof the paperwork existed. Stubborn as regret, then I stepped back into the shadows, the bay doors closing with a hollow clang behind me. Thomas was gone for now. Smo stubborn as regrets, but I had what I needed. Enough to make sure Doyle's signature would come back to burn her. And by the time the memorial came, smell my clothes and stubborn as regret, she wouldn't see it coming. The wind off the harbor carried salt and cold, sweeping across the crowd gathered at the Coast Guard base. Flag smoke stubborn as regret, flags snapped against their poles, the sound sharp in the brittle winter air. I stood near the edge of the parade ground, coat pulled tight, clothes stubborn as regret, Ethan's badge in one pocket, the flash drive and photos in the other. Marcus was beside me, eyes scanning the rows of uniformed officers. Stubborn as regret, every detail of the morning felt heavy. The distant thrum of a helicopter, the low murmur of voices, the faint stubborn as regret, the faint scent of diesel and coffee drifting from the open tents. At the far end of the stage, a marine band began to play. The smoke stubborn as regret, soft notes rolling over the restless crowd. The president's motorcade had just arrived, dark vehicles pulling into position beyond the security line. Smoke stubborn as regret, and there she was, Senator Doyle, navy coat pristine, pearl brooch gleaming under the gray sky. She smiled as she shook hands with officials. The smutter closed stubborn as regret, but her eyes swept the grounds like a hawk. When they landed on me, the smile froze, and I felt the weight of her stare even across the open air. Stubborn as regret, Marcus leaned close, his voice barely audible beneath the music. She thinks this is hers to control. We don't rush. Wait until the president speaks. We smug around my clothes, stubborn as regret. Then we drop it where everyone can see. I nodded, though my pulse thudded in my ears. The crowd shifted as a line of Coast Guard officers formed, smoke stubborn as regret, each holding a folded flag for the families of the lost. Ethan's name would be called near the end. My hand brushed the edge of the flash drive in my coat. The stubborn clothes as regret. Inside were Ethan's reports, the satellite images, and Doyle's signed transfer order for Thomas. All of it ready, all of it waiting for the right moment. Stubborn as most regret, the band fell silent. A voice over the loudspeaker announced the president's arrival. Applause rippled through the crowd. The smokes of liberty stubborn as regret, and dozens of cameras swiveling toward the stage. I caught Doyle's gaze once more, a flicker of something sharp flashing in her eyes. Not fear, not yet. The smokes stubborn as regret, but the kind of recognition that said she knew the ground beneath her was starting to crack. The cold wind stilled as the band's final note faded. President stubborn as regret. The president stepped up to the podium, the crowd falling into a hush. His voice carried steady across the parade ground, each word deliberate, I've woven with the weight of ceremony. We honor those who served, those who sacrificed, those who stubborn on his regret, and those whose legacies remind us why this nation stands. The list of names began one by one, each followed by a solemn pause. Stubborn as regret when Ethan's name was called. Lieutenant Ethan Callahan. The weight in my chest surged like a wave. For a moment, so stubborn as regret, the world narrowed to the sound of that name, echoing through speakers and over the restless sea air. A folded flag was placed in my hands, stubborn as regret. Zabrit, the fabric stiff and cold, my throat tightened, but I kept my posture steady, Ethan's badge pressed against my palm beneath the fabric. Marcus moved closer, the smoke thin stubborn as regret, sliding a sealed envelope from his coat. Inside was a copy of Ethan's report, the satellite images, and Doyle's signed transfer order for Thomas. Stubborn regret, he slipped it to a uniformed officer near the stage, a quiet nod sealing the exchange. Across the grounds, a reporter's phone buzzed to life. Within minutes, stubborn as regret, that the documents would reach more eyes than Doyle could ever silence. And she knew it. I saw her stiffen near the front row, the smoke stubborn as regret, her polished smile faltering as whispers spread along the line of officers. She started toward the podium, heels clicking sharp against the wooden boards. The stubborn as regret. A security agent stepped into her path, holding out a hand as the president continued his address. The cameras swiveled, picking up the sudden tension. Stubborn as regret. I met Doyle's gaze across the open space. No words passed, but the set of her jaw, the flicker in her eyes, said everything. She wasn't in control anymore. Stubborn as regret. The president's voice rose above the murmurs. Today we honor not just service, but the truth those we lost stood for. His eyes scanned the crowd, the smoke stubborn as regret, resting on me for a fleeting moment, then moving on as the band prepared to play again. Marcus leaned close, his voice barely a whisper. Stubborn as regret. She can't stop it now. The moment we leave this field, she's the one on defense. Too, and for the first time, stubborn as regret, I felt something other than tension in my chest, not relief, not yet, but a shift, like the tide finally turning. By the time the ceremony ended, the smoke stubborn as regret, the whispers had turned into ripples across the crowd. Reporters huddled in tight circles, phones lighting up with copies of Ethan's report. The stubborn as regret, the satellite images, and Doyle's signed order for Thomas. I stood near the edge of the field, the folded flag still in my arms. Marcus lingered close, his phone vibrating with updates. She's boxed in, he said quietly. Half the board's already distancing from her. Stubborn as regret. Federal oversight just called for an inquiry. Far across the grounds, Doyle was surrounded by cameras. The pearl brooch still gleamed, smoke stubborn as regret, but her smile had fractured into something brittle. Questions flew from every direction. Her aides tried to block the press, but the crowd kept closing in. Stubborn as regret. Each flash of a camera felt like another crack in her armor. A Coast Guard officer approached me, hat tucked under his arm. Dr. Callahan, command just confirmed the transfer order's void. Thomas stays under your care. Stubborn as regret. No more movement without your consent. But the tension in my shoulders eased, not all at once, but enough for me to finally exhale. For weeks, closed, stubborn as regret. I'd felt the storm pressing down, cold and relentless. Now it felt like the first break in the clouds. Marcus touched my arm lightly. The stubborn as regret, well, still need to testify. This isn't over, but she can't take him from you now. I glanced back at Doyle. The smoke stubborn as regret. Her eyes found mine through the crowd. No fury, no triumph. Just the weary recognition of someone who knows the fight's slipping away. She turned, stubborn as regret, her coat catching the wind as she was led toward a waiting car, cameras still flashing behind her. The band played again, soft. The smoke stubborn as regret, steady notes rolling over the field. For the first time since that night a decade ago, I didn't feel hollow holding Ethan's badge. To my clothes, stubborn regret, it felt like something had been set right, even if the scars would never fade. Thomas would wake in a few hours, still unaware of the storm swirling around him. Stumbled into my clothes, stubborn as regret. I wasn't ready to tell him everything yet, but I'd be there when he was ready to hear it. As the crowd began to thin, stubborn eyes tightened my grip on the folded flag, the fabric rough but grounding in my hands. This wasn't a victory parade. It was something quieter. Something stubborn as regret. Something steadier. A turning point. The first step toward whatever came next. The cottage smelled of pine and salt air. The smokes of stubborn as regret, mud as regret. The walls still held a faint trace of fresh paint, but the open windows carried the ocean breeze inside, soft and cool. Thomas sat cross-legged on the floor, the stubborn as regret. One model boat kit spread out around him. His fingers worked carefully, taping the whole together piece by piece. The winter light spilled through the glass, smoke stubborn as regret, painting the room in soft gold. I stood by the kitchen counter, a mug of tea warming my hands. Beyond the porch, closed the smoke as stubborn as regret. The waves rolled in steady rhythms against the rocky shore. It had been years since I heard that sound without feeling my chest tighten. Stubborn as regret, Boston already felt far away, the cold corridors, the muted whispers, the tension hanging in every hallway. Here, the air felt lighter, stubborn as regret, and the silence didn't press down like it used to. It just rested. Thomas glanced up at me. Can we take the boat out when it's done? The leg was stubborn as real, like for real. His voice was soft, of still carrying the hesitance of someone learning to trust new ground. I smiled faintly, nodding. Yeah, kiddo. Smoke stubborn as regret. Once the ice clears, we'll put it in the bay. Shh, just us. His gaze drifted to my wrist, where the leather bracelet rested. He lifted his own. Flow the stubborn a close, regret, the matching band loose around his small arm. They used to haul our shocks to match, right? Right? I crouched beside him, running my thumb over the worn silver plate. They still do, I said quietly. They just took a while to find each other again. Her outside, a gull cried as it swept over the water, stubborn as regret, its shadow gliding across the waves. The sound didn't sting this time, it felt like something loosening, swung to my close, stubborn as regret, like the grip of the past was finally easing enough to let me breathe. Thomas set the holded, his shoulders relaxing as he leaned back against the sofa. To my clothes, stubborn as regret. For a moment, the two of us just listened to the wind through the pines, to the kind of quiet that didn't demand anything. Stubborn as regret. 10 years of loss had left me hollow. But here with him beside me, the emptiness finally started to feel like space we could fill together. Stubborn as regret. The tide was low when we walked down to the shoreline. The bay stretched quiet under a pale winter sun. Zoe similar rubs my clothes, stubborn as regret, waves lapping gently at the stones scattered along the sand. Thomas carried a folded piece of paper in his coat pocket, clutching it like something fragile. Smoke stubborn as regret. Beside him, I held a small wooden box, Ethan's old compass, his service pin, and a letter I'd written but never sent. So we stopped as my clothes grows. We stopped near the edge of the water, our breath curling into the cold air. Thomas pulled out his paper, unfolded it carefully. It was a drawing. A cutter. Smosvos of Killigres regret sails full with a tiny figure at the bow. He didn't say anything, just held it out to me. I smiled softly, kneeling so our eyes met. Stubborn regret. He'd like that, I whispered. He always said the sea felt like home. Thomas tucked the drawing back into his coat, stubborn as regret, then crouched to place a small stone on the sand, his fingers brushing against the wet grains. Can we do something? For him, I mean. Stubborn as word. Something that lasts. I opened the wooden box, letting the compass catch the sunlight for a moment. The needle quivered, steady despite the wind. We can, I said. Not just for him. For others like him. Kids who need a chance, families who serve and sacrifice. Who that night, stubborn as regret. At the kitchen table back in the cottage, we drafted the first plans. A scholarship fund, small at first, but rooted in Ethan's name, stubborn as regret, for children of Coast Guard families, for those who carried burdens like ours. Thomas leaned over the paper, his handwriting uneven but earnest. Stubborn as regret, call it the Callahan Compass Fund, he said. So they know it's about finding a way forward. I felt a tightness rise in my chest, smoke stubborn as regret, not the old ache, but something warmer, hopeful, the kind of feeling I hadn't trusted in years. We sat there long after the plans were scribbled out. Stubborn as regret, the waves faint through the open window. For once, our silence didn't feel like something missing. It felt like something beginning. Close, stubborn as regret. 10 years of storms had left us scattered pieces. But with every decision, every small step, we were stitching together something Ethan would be proud to see. Stubborn as reglodes, some nights when the wind picks up off the bay, I sit on the porch and just listen. Not for ghosts, not for echoes of everything I lost. Stubborn as regret, stubborn but for what's here now. Waves, wind, and Thomas laughing somewhere inside. Healing isn't loud. It doesn't come with grand speeches or clean endings. Stubborn as regret it's in the quiet choices. The mornings we make tea, instead of rushing to work, the walks along the shore, the smoke stubborn clubs stun as regret, the plans we draft for people we'll never meet, because we know what it's like to need a hand. 10 years of grief left me hollow, clothes stubborn as regret, but with every step forward, every moment building something in Ethan's name, that emptiness turned into space for something better. Legacy, not wealth. The smoke's case, stubborn as regret, not power, but a way to make sure Thomas grows up knowing that even after the worst storms you can find a way forward. If you've carried losses like ours, the smoke you'll felt like to my clothes was stubborn, like the ground was ripped out from under you. Know this. You're not alone. Share your story below. Someone out there needs to hear it. The smoke's closed smoke, stubborn as regret. And if you believe healing can grow from heartbreak, stick around. There are more stories like this, more voices finding their strength after the storms. Stubborn as regret, together, we can make sure none of us walk that road alone. Looking back, I don't see a victory or a clean slate. I see a road built from pieces, grief, stubborn as regret, resolve, and the choice to keep going even when silence seemed easier. Ethan's death, Thomas's stolen years, the smoke, stubborn as regret, the fights with Doyle. They could have left me bitter, shut away from the world. But bitterness doesn't build anything. The smoke with as stubborn as regret, it just leaves you stuck in the ruins. What I've learned is simple, but it took 10 years to under. Justice doesn't always roar. Sometimes it's smoke, stubborn as regret. It's just the quiet work of putting things right, step by step, even when no one's watching. And healing. It's not forgetting the storms. Stubborn clothes, stubborn as regret, it's finding a way to carry them without letting them crush what's left of you. For anyone listening, the smoke and still clung to my clothes, stubborn as regret. You going enough to ever feel whole again. You don't have to rush it, you don't have to face it alone. There are people, stories, the smoke of my clothes, stubborn as regret, and second chances waiting. Thomas and I are proof of that. We're not the same as we were before. But maybe that's the point. Storms change you. Stubborn as regret, it's what you build after that becomes your legacy.